Before we open these oldest chapters, leave a mark of your presence. Share in the comments the city from which you are listening, so this knowledge may travel farther than the roads of Faerûn ever did. If these chronicles speak to you, consider subscribing and walk with me through ages most histories forget. Now listen, as the world itself remembers. Long before the first human breath warmed the air of Faerûn, the world existed in a state that later minds would struggle to imagine. There were no villages to mark the valleys, no roads worn into the land by repetition, no calendars to measure passing years. What existed instead was consequence. The Dawn War had ended, and its echoes still trembled through stone, sea, and sky. The primordials, beings of raw elemental force, had been slain, imprisoned, or cast beyond the world, and the gods stood as victors over a creation that had nearly been torn apart in its making. Faerûn at this time was not a quiet place, but it was finally a stable one. Mountains no longer rose overnight in fury, yet their jagged spines still showed where earth had been folded like cloth by divine struggle. Oceans had settled into their basins, though their depths concealed scars left by battles fought beneath the waves. The skies, once choked with ash and fire, now carried weather that followed patterns rather than rage. The world had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a domain. This was the first truth of the age before humans. The land itself was older than any mortal story would ever claim. Every forest grew atop ancient wounds. Every plain lay smoothed over by time and divine restraint. The gods did not rebuild Faerûn from nothing. They tempered what survived. And in doing so, they allowed new powers to rise upon its surface. Among the first to truly dominate this quieted world were the dragons, born of the world's earliest fires and shaped by draconic deities such as Io and his divided aspects. Dragons were not merely creatures of instinct. They were inheritors. In this age, they did not hoard ruins, for there were no ruins yet to plunder. They ruled skies that belonged to them by right of age and strength. Entire regions bent beneath the shadow of ancient worms whose names would never be spoken by mortals, because mortals did not yet exist to speak them. Opposing them, though not always in open war, were the giants. Giant kind rose under the guidance of Anam the All-Father, whose ordning imposed a rigid hierarchy upon their societies. This structure was not simply cultural, it was cosmic. In a world freshly ordered after chaos, giants reflected divine intent through rank and role. They raised fortresses of stone and ice, not as cities, but as assertions of permanence. Where dragons ruled through individual might, giants ruled through structure and inherited authority. The tension between these two powers did not yet erupt into the cataclysmic dragon-giant war of later ages, but its foundations were already laid. Territory mattered, balance mattered, and Faerûn was vast enough to allow both to grow, until it would no longer be. Beyond dragon and giant domains, other beings walked the world without fear of extinction. The Fae, closer to Faerûn than they would ever be again, shaped forests and wild places where the boundaries between the world and the Feywild thinned. Time behaved strangely in these regions. Growth followed unfamiliar rules. Nothing there was built to last forever, because nothing needed to. Mortality was not yet the measure of value. Elemental creatures, remnants of primordial influence, still existed in great numbers. They were no longer masters of the world, but neither were they rare. Volcanoes, storm-racked coasts, and endless deserts were their sanctuaries, places where the old forces still whispered beneath the surface. The gods allowed this. Absolute purity had never been their goal. Stability was, and above it all lay the weave. Maestra's gift, or burden, to the world had begun to settle into its enduring form. Magic was no longer a wild current tearing reality apart. It flowed. It could be shaped. It obeyed laws, even if those laws were not yet written or understood. This quiet stabilization was more important than any single victory of the Dawn War, because it made something unprecedented possible. For the first time, Toril could sustain beings who were fragile. The gods observed this world not as gardeners tending crops, but as custodians testing whether the land could endure without constant correction. They intervened rarely. Consequence replaced command. When dragons overreached, rivals answered. When giants expanded too far, balance pushed back. The world learned equilibrium through pressure, not instruction. By the end of this age, Toril had become something new, a world no longer defined by divine conflict, yet still untouched by mortal hands. It was vast, ancient, and waiting, not in anticipation, but in readiness. The stage was set, though no audience yet existed to witness what would come. What changed was not the will of the gods, but the nature of the world itself. And that quiet transformation would matter more than any war that came before. The age before humans did not unfold in years that could be counted, but in slow adjustments measured by stability. After the gods withdrew from constant intervention, Toril entered a long period in which power expressed itself through endurance rather than upheaval. What mattered was not who could shatter the world, but who could exist within it without breaking what remained. In this quieter era, dragons refined their dominion. The eldest among them remembered the raw chaos of creation and understood what restraint cost. They claimed vast territories, not as kingdoms with borders, but as ranges of influence defined by sky, flame, and fear. An ancient dragon did not rule a city. It ruled weather patterns, migration paths, and the silence of lesser creatures that learned where not to tread. This was not tyranny in the mortal sense. It was ecological authority, enforced by presence alone. Dragonkind also began to diverge more clearly in purpose and belief. Chromatic and metallic distinctions, already rooted in draconic creation myths tied to Tiamat and Bahamut, manifested not only in temperament, but in how dragons interacted with the world. Some shaped their domains to endure across ages, while others cared only for dominance in the present moment. The absence of mortals meant there was no one to record these differences, yet they mattered because they shaped the conflicts to come. Giants, meanwhile, expanded with deliberate intent. Guided by the ordning, they believed the world itself recognized hierarchy as a natural law. Storm giants ruled coastlines and open seas, reading the will of the gods in shifting skies. Fire giants claimed volcanic regions and mountain forges, shaping stone and metal with methods that would later be mistaken for magic. Frost giants spread across the far north, adapting to cold that still carried the memory of primordial ice. Each caste saw its place not as ambition, but as destiny. This belief gave giant society stability and rigidity. The ordning did not encourage innovation, it preserved role. As Toril settled further, this rigidity became both strength and weakness. Giants endured where others faded, but they also struggled to adapt to changes that did not respect hierarchy. Beyond these dominant powers, Toril's surface was far from empty. Fae courts moved freely between their realm and the material world, especially in regions where magic pooled naturally. Ancient forests were not planted, they awakened. Trees grew in patterns that reflected unseen geometries, and glades formed where the weave bent inward. These places were not claimed by dragons or giants, not because they were weak, but because claiming them came at a cost neither wished to pay. The Fae did not fight wars of conquest. They altered meaning. Elemental beings also persisted, especially in areas where primordial influence had been bound rather than erased. Great deserts were shaped not by lack of water alone, but by ancient fire that had been cooled, not extinguished. Storms gathered in predictable seasons, yet some still carried intelligence within their winds. The world remembered what it had been, even as it learned to be something else. Above all this lay divine observation. The gods did not abandon Toril after the Dawn War. They watched it. Their concern was no longer survival, but suitability. The world was being tested quietly. Could it sustain cycles without divine correction? Could it hold magic without tearing itself apart? Could power exist without reverting to chaos? The answer, slowly, became yes. The most important change of this era was subtle. The weave grew consistent. Magic no longer surged unpredictably from wounds in reality. It settled into patterns that rewarded understanding over raw force. This did not benefit dragons or giants equally. For the first time, knowledge began to rival size and strength as a source of power. That shift mattered more than any territorial gain. A world where power could be learned, rather than inherited by creation, was a world no longer reserved for immortals. By the close of this phase of the age before humans, Toril had become balanced enough to be vulnerable. Not to destruction, but to change. The great powers still ruled, but the conditions that favored only them were quietly ending. The world had learned to endure, and endurance made room for something new to survive. As Toril continued to stabilize, the nature of power upon the world began to change in ways that even the eldest beings did not immediately recognize. The age before humans was not a static epoch of unchallenged dominance, but a slow reordering of what dominance meant. Strength still mattered, but it no longer explained everything that endured. Dragons remained supreme in many regions, yet even they felt the difference. Their memories stretched back to a time when raw might could remake landscapes in moments. Now the world resisted such excess. Mountains no longer answered fury. Seas no longer boiled at a single command. This was not weakness in Toril. It was resilience. The planet had learned its limits, and those limits applied to everyone. This resistance forced adaptation. Some dragons withdrew, ruling from isolation rather than expansion. Others turned inward, pursuing knowledge, sorcery, and the refinement of breath and magic. Lairs became centers of accumulated understanding as much as hoards of wealth. The absence of mortals meant knowledge circulated slowly, guarded jealously by those who held it. Power was becoming deliberate. Giants encountered a different challenge. The ordning had served them well in a world defined by chaos and aftermath. But as Toril grew quieter, hierarchy alone no longer guaranteed success. Regions once hostile became stable enough to support long-term presence, and the giants' traditional domains began to overlap more frequently with those of dragons. These encounters were not yet wars, but they were no longer avoidable. Storm giants, sensitive to divine intention, were among the first to sense unease. The signs they read in sky and sea did not point to immediate catastrophe, but to imbalance slowly returning through accumulation rather than explosion. Fire giants responded differently, increasing their works of craft and fortification, believing permanence could be forged into the world itself. Frost giants expanded outward, testing the edges of colder lands, as ice slowly receded from regions once claimed by primordial cold. Meanwhile, the Fae presence on Toril reached its height. With no mortal civilizations to push back against them, the boundaries between the Feywild and the material world blurred in countless locations. Time fractured in these places. A season could pass in a moment, or a moment could stretch into years. These were not accidents, but expressions of a world still learning how tightly its layers should be bound together. The gods allowed this closeness for a reason. Fey influence acted as a pressure valve, preventing magic from concentrating too heavily in any single region. It also revealed something important. Toril could support multiple modes of existence at once. Linear time, cyclical time, and agelessness could coexist without collapsing reality. This discovery would later shape how mortals experienced magic, prophecy, and divine intervention. The elemental remnants of primordial power began to diminish more noticeably during this period, not because they were destroyed, but because the world no longer favored them. Raw expression gave way to structured reality. Elementals that endured did so by anchoring themselves to specific locations. Volcanoes, storm fronts, deep rifts, becoming guardians or hazards rather than rulers. The age of elemental dominance had truly ended. In the heavens, the gods debated less and observed more. Their role had shifted from creators and warriors to judges of outcome. Io's imposed order after the Dawn War limited direct divine interference, forcing even deities to respect the autonomy of the world they had claimed. This distance was not indifference. It was a test of sustainability. By this stage of the age before humans, Toril had become layered with history that no one yet recorded. Choices made by dragons, giants, and fae were no longer erased by catastrophe. They accumulated. Borders hardened. Magical flows stabilized. Cause and consequence began to resemble the patterns that mortals would later recognize as history. The world was no longer ancient chaos wearing the shape of land. It was becoming a place where the past mattered, where actions endured beyond the moment of their making. And in that endurance lay the quiet precondition for every mortal story that would one day follow. With endurance replacing upheaval, Toril entered a phase where dominion was measured not by conquest, but by continuity. The great powers of the age before humans no longer expanded endlessly. Instead, they learned to hold what they claimed. This shift did not lessen conflict, but it changed its character. Disputes became prolonged, calculated, and consequential in ways that reshaped the world slowly rather than violently. It was during this time that the unspoken rivalry between dragons and giants hardened into something more deliberate. Their domains increasingly pressed against one another as stable climates and predictable magic reduced the natural barriers that once kept them apart. Mountains that had been impassable during the world's volatile youth became settled regions of stone and ice. Skies once torn by elemental storms grew calmer, making aerial dominion more contested. Coexistence became more difficult, not because either side grew weaker, but because the world itself had become usable. Dragons viewed this as an encroachment. To them, Toril was a realm of inherited supremacy, shaped in ages when their kind had no rivals capable of challenging them across continents. Giants, guided by the Ordning, saw the same expansion as fulfillment of divine structure. Where dragons claimed by presence, giants claimed by purpose. Each believed the world naturally favored their rule, and Toril offered no clear answer. This tension manifested subtly at first. Hunting grounds shifted, mountain passes closed, coastal skies grew dangerous, where storm giants and ancient worms contested the same horizons. These encounters rarely ended in open battle, but each left marks, collapsed peaks, altered currents, regions avoided by both sides. The world absorbed these pressures, but it did not forget them. Meanwhile, the Fey realms began to withdraw, though not abruptly. As dragons and giants asserted greater control over stable territories, the fluid spaces favored by the Fey grew rarer. Forests once shaped by living magic became anchored to linear time. Glades closed, crossings thinned. This was not exile, but adjustment. Toril was becoming less permissive of ambiguity. The weave played a decisive role in this change. As Mystra's design settled further, magic rewarded intent and discipline. Spontaneous reality warping became increasingly difficult. This favored beings who could learn, study, and refine their power over long ages. Dragons adapted readily to this shift. Giants, whose magic was often tied to blood, rank, and divine favor, adapted more slowly. Elemental forces continued their decline into specialization. Fire no longer roamed freely across continents. It burned where conditions allowed it. Storms followed seasons. Ice retreated or advanced according to patterns rather than memory. The world had accepted limits, and in doing so, it constrained every being upon it. The gods watched these developments closely. They saw that Toril no longer required constant correction, but they also recognized a new risk: stagnation. A world ruled forever by immortals could endure, but it could not evolve. Balance would eventually calcify into permanence, and permanence would resist divine purpose as surely as chaos once had. By the end of this phase, Toril stood at a quiet threshold. The great powers still dominated, but their dominance had become self-reinforcing rather than dynamic. The world was stable enough to last forever, unless something entered it that could change faster than immortals could adapt. That possibility had not yet taken form, but the conditions that would allow it were already fixed into the bones of the world. The age before humans reached its deepest equilibrium when time itself began to matter. For immortal beings, time had always been an abundance rather than a constraint, but Toril was no longer shaped by moments of divine excess. Change now accumulated slowly, and this altered the meaning of immortality. To endure was no longer enough. One had to remain relevant. Dragons responded by turning increasingly toward mastery of magic. As the weave stabilized, arcane knowledge became cumulative rather than volatile. Ancient worms learned that spells, once perfected, could be refined across centuries without losing potency. Lairs became repositories of layered enchantment, places where magic had been tested, altered, and bound into the surrounding land. A dragon's territory was no longer defined solely by fear, but by invisible thresholds where magic bent to its will. Giants experienced this shift differently. Their power had always been communal and hierarchical, reinforced by divine mandate rather than individual study. As magic became more technical, giants relied more heavily on tradition, ritual, and inherited authority. This preserved their societies, but it also limited their flexibility. Storm giants, closest to divine currents, adapted best, interpreting the changing world as a sign that the gods expected patience rather than dominance. Other giant kind held to older assumptions, believing the ordning itself would correct any imbalance. In the deep places of Toril, something quieter occurred. The world's magical currents slowed enough that the first true ley lines became fixed. These invisible pathways of power did not favor size or strength. They favored proximity, awareness, and control. For the first time, power could be localized without overwhelming the surrounding region. This development mattered profoundly, though no one yet recognized its full consequence. Fae enclaves reacted to this change by withdrawing further. As magic became structured, it lost the fluidity that sustained their presence. Where once forests could shift and reshape themselves freely, they now followed predictable growth. Fae crossings closed not by force, but by incompatibility. Toril was choosing consistency over wonder, and the Fae followed the paths that still welcomed them. Elemental beings continued to adapt by binding themselves to place. Some volcanoes became permanently inhabited by fire entities that no longer sought conquest. Certain storms gained identities tied to seasonal cycles rather than roaming intent. These were not defeats. They were accommodations. The world no longer rewarded those who refused to belong. The gods perceived this era as confirmation. Toril had reached a state where power could be expressed without constant destruction. That success carried an unintended implication. A world this stable could sustain lives that were brief, fragile, and numerous. Immortality was no longer required to survive. This realization did not prompt immediate creation. The gods were cautious. They had learned from the Dawn War that unchecked intervention carried consequences that echoed for ages. Instead, they allowed the world to continue proving itself. They watched to see whether equilibrium could persist without stagnation, and whether meaning could arise from limitation rather than excess. By the end of this phase, Toril had become a world of systems rather than reactions. Magic flowed in channels. Power followed patterns. Dominance required understanding, not merely presence. The age before humans was no longer defined by what the world had survived, but by what it was now capable of supporting. And in that capability lay the quiet precondition for mortality to exist at all. When Toril learned to support limitation, it also learned to support consequence. In earlier ages, mistakes could be erased by scale, overwhelmed by greater power, or undone by divine correction. Now, errors endured. Decisions made by dragons, giants, and other ancient beings reshaped regions for ages, not moments. The world had become a ledger of actions, though no one yet recorded it. This permanence altered conflict. Disputes between great powers increasingly avoided total confrontation, because total confrontation risked outcomes that could not be reversed. A mountain shattered by rage would not rise again. A sea poisoned by excess magic would remain hostile long after victory was claimed. Even immortals began to weigh cost against pride, a calculation that would later define mortal politics. Dragons, long accustomed to singular dominance, felt this pressure keenly. Their rivalries grew more precise. Territorial boundaries hardened, marked not by walls but by magical signatures and ancestral memory. Younger dragons learned restraint from the consequences suffered by elders who had pushed too far. For the first time, draconic power was tempered by precedent rather than instinct. Giants responded with consolidation. Their realms became more internally ordered, less expansive. The ordning tightened its grip, reinforcing roles to preserve stability. This brought endurance, but it also narrowed possibility. Giants excelled at maintaining what already existed, yet struggled when faced with shifts that did not respect rank or tradition. The world was changing, and the ordning resisted change by design. In the spaces between these powers, Toril's lesser immortals adapted quietly. Ancient beasts, long-lived but not eternal, found niches where they could persist without challenge. Magical flora rooted itself along stable ley intersections, altering landscapes subtly over centuries. These developments were not grand enough to draw divine attention, yet they mattered. They demonstrated that survival no longer required supremacy. The weave continued to reward intention over force. Raw magical surges became increasingly inefficient, even dangerous. Precision, knowledge, and discipline proved safer and more effective. This shift subtly undermined beings whose power relied on overwhelming presence alone. It elevated those capable of learning, remembering, and refining their methods across time. The gods recognized the implication before any other beings did. A world where knowledge compounded could support cultures rather than castes. It could sustain succession. It could allow one generation to build upon the last without divine intervention. This was not the world the gods had originally forged, but it was one they now saw value in preserving. As a result, divine restraint deepened. Intervention became rarer, more symbolic, more indirect. Signs replaced commands. Omens replaced appearances. Toril was being allowed to test whether meaning could emerge without constant guidance. This restraint did not weaken divine authority. It refined it. By the close of this phase, the age before humans had become an age of memory without witnesses. The world remembered every action, yet no minds existed to contextualize those memories as history. Power still ruled, but it ruled within boundaries. Magic still flowed, but it obeyed structure. Toril had become a place where continuity mattered more than dominance. And that shift, more than any battle or decree, prepared the world for lives that would measure meaning not in ages, but in years. By the later stages of the age before humans, Toril had entered a condition that could best be described as quiet saturation. Power still existed everywhere, but nowhere did it overflow. The world was full, not strained. This fullness changed how ancient beings perceived their own eternity. When nothing urgent threatened existence, purpose became harder to define. Dragons began to experience this first. Their memories stretched across epochs, yet the future no longer promised dramatic change. Some withdrew into deep isolation, sleeping through centuries rather than shaping them. Others turned to prophecy, attempting to read meaning in patterns of magic and movement rather than events. The world was no longer dramatic enough to justify constant action, and idleness became a form of decline. Giants felt a different pressure. Their cultures, bound tightly to the ordning, depended on active relevance to divine will. As the gods intervened less, interpretation replaced instruction. Storm giants debated signs that were no longer clear. Lesser giant castes continued their roles out of tradition rather than necessity. Stability preserved them, but it also eroded the certainty that their place in the world was divinely essential. In the margins, the Fae presence diminished to a whisper. Where once entire forests had existed half in dream, only isolated crossings remained. These places became rarities rather than norms, protected by obscurity instead of power. The retreat was not forced. It was inevitable. Toril's commitment to consistency left little room for beings whose nature resisted permanence. Elemental entities that remained were no longer reminders of primordial dominance, but features of the landscape itself. A volcano was not a threat. It was a condition. A storm was not a will. It was a cycle. The world had absorbed its oldest enemies and turned them into processes. The most profound change of this era was psychological rather than physical. Immortals began to recognize that the world no longer needed them to function. Toril persisted, whether dragons ruled its skies or giants held its mountains. This realization carried weight. For beings who had once shaped reality by existence alone, irrelevance was a concept more unsettling than death. The gods understood this tension and allowed it to persist. A world dependent on immortals would never accept anything weaker. A world indifferent to immortals could. Divine patience, once a strategy to avoid chaos, became a deliberate preparation for succession. By the end of this phase, Tyrell was no longer waiting in ignorance. It was complete in form, yet incomplete in experience. It had depth without perspective, memory without narrative. Everything required for life existed, except minds that would see the world as something that could be lost. And that absence had become the final condition that could not remain unmet. The transition toward a world that could host mortals did not begin with creation, but with restraint. The gods did not introduce new life until they were certain that Tyrell would not consume it. This caution defined the closing stretch of the age before humans more than any visible event. The world was being observed not for power, but for mercy. Tyrell had become predictable in the ways that mattered. Seasons followed cycles. Magic responded to understanding. Landscapes no longer shifted without cause. This predictability was not simplicity, it was reliability. A fragile being could learn where to live, when to move, and how to survive without being erased by forces beyond comprehension. The world had learned how to allow weakness to persist. Dragons and giants continued to rule, but their dominance had softened into habit. They still controlled vast territories, yet fewer of them sought expansion. The effort required no longer justified the reward. Territories were maintained rather than contested. Conflict, when it occurred, was limited, contained, and increasingly rare. Tyrell no longer invited escalation. This environment revealed a truth the gods could no longer ignore. Immortals alone could not give the world meaning. They could preserve it. They could dominate it. But they could not experience it as finite. Without finitude, nothing was truly at stake. Loss was temporary. Failure was delay. Even defeat could be waited out. The weave, now fully stabilized, reflected this truth. Its structure favored incremental growth and layered understanding. Power could be passed on. Knowledge could outlive its bearer. These were not features designed for dragons or giants. They were foundations for succession. Divine deliberation followed, not argument, but alignment. The gods agreed that Tyrell had reached a state where mortality would not be annihilated on contact. Short lives could exist without divine shielding. Choice could matter because it could not be undone by waiting. Consequence could shape belief. Importantly, this decision was not made in response to crisis. Nothing was broken. Nothing demanded correction. Mortals were not created to fix the world. They were created because the world was finally capable of being experienced. By the close of this phase, Tyrell stood unchanged on the surface, yet fundamentally redefined. For the first time since the Dawn War, the future was not about stability or dominance. It was about perspective. The age before humans had fulfilled its purpose, not by ending in catastrophe, but by proving that the world could endure something far more fragile than itself. The final movement of the age before humans unfolded without proclamation. No sky darkened. No divine voice announced completion. Instead, Tyrell revealed its readiness through absence, through what no longer happened. Catastrophes ceased to be routine. Power no longer defaulted to annihilation. The world had learned restraint without instruction. This restraint reshaped the great powers more deeply than any war had done. Dragons, once defined by unchallenged supremacy, now existed in a world that neither feared nor required them. Their ancient memories gave them depth, but also distance. Many retreated into long dormancy, not from weakness, but from lack of necessity. A world that no longer needed to be ruled did not reward constant vigilance. Giants persisted through tradition. Their realms endured. Their hierarchies remained intact. Yet their divine certainty faded into interpretation. The ordning still structured giant society, but its cosmic urgency softened. Giants continued because they had always continued. Purpose had become inherited rather than reaffirmed. Across Toril, environments reached mature equilibrium. Forests stopped expanding and began renewing themselves. Mountains eroded at measured rates. Seas stabilized into long-term currents. These were not signs of decay, but of sustainability. The world no longer exhausted itself maintaining form. It conserved. Magic reflected this conservation. The weave favored stability over excess, continuity over spectacle. Its laws no longer bent easily to raw desire. This quiet resistance ensured that any being who wished to wield power would have to understand it. Strength alone was insufficient. Memory mattered. Learning mattered. The gods observed one final condition taking shape. Consequence had become irreversible on a meaningful scale. While immortals could wait out setbacks, the world itself could not easily be undone. Damage persisted. Change accumulated. This made Toril a place where decisions carried weight beyond the decision-maker. That weight was essential. Without it, mortality would be meaningless. A short life in a reversible world would leave no trace. But Toril had become a place where even brief existence could alter the future. No new beings yet walked the land, but the world had become sensitive to presence. Paths formed where none had been worn. Sheltered regions existed where fragility could survive. Resources replenished at rates that could sustain growth rather than dominance. The age before humans did not end because something arrived. It ended because the world could now receive. Everything that followed would be shaped by this readiness, though those who came later would never know how close Toril had once been to being uninhabitable to them. The age closed not with silence, but with capacity. The age before humans concluded not with disappearance, but with inheritance. Dragons still slept beneath mountains and ruled distant skies. Giants still walked their ordered paths across stone and sea. Fey crossings still flickered in rare, hidden places. Nothing was removed from Toril to make room for what would come. The world simply no longer belonged exclusively to the eternal. What defined this ending was readiness. Toril had learned to hold memory without collapse, power without excess, and magic without chaos. The land could now be changed by small hands without being broken. Rivers could be diverted. Forests could be cleared and regrown. Stones could be shaped into meaning rather than monuments to dominance. The gods, bound by restraint after the Dawn War and guided by Io's imposed order, did not descend to claim this moment. Their work was already done. Creation no longer required force. It required allowance. Mortality would not be a correction to the world, but a consequence of its success. This truth redefined everything that followed. Mortals would later believe themselves fragile because they were young. In reality, they were fragile because the world no longer revolved around survival alone. Toril could afford beings who lived briefly, learned quickly, and changed faster than immortals ever could. The ancient powers did not foresee how profound this change would be. Dragons would one day hoard what mortals created. Giants would remember an age when the world answered only to gods and titans. Fae would mourn a closeness that could never fully return. All of them would be shaped, not by conquest, but by comparison. The age before humans was not a lost paradise, nor a forgotten golden age. It was a preparation. Every mountain placed, every current set, every law of magic stabilized, was an act of groundwork. Mortals would arrive into a world already burdened with ancient decisions they did not make. And that burden was the final gift of the age. Because Toril was not built for mortals to inherit perfection. It was built for them to inherit consequence.